is the DAWbench Radio Show, the official podcast of DAWbench.com.
Welcome to the DAWbench Radio Show. I am your host, Curigliano of AAVIM Technology in Melbourne, Australia. And today I am joined by my special guest from Maryland in the United States of America, and that is Pete Brown of Microsoft, whose job description includes Principal Program Manager for Windows and Devices, and a few other acronyms that I'll let Pete explain in detail if he feels warranted. Welcome, Pete.
Hi, Vin. Thanks for having me on the show here. Yeah, we love our acronyms at Microsoft.
Yes.
So I'm in the PAX group with PAX,
Yep.
which is Partners, Analytics, and Essential Experiences.
Wow.
The X is the
experiences.
It's certainly forced in there. It's like 10 characters into it, right? So, but that's part of Panos Panay's Windows and Devices org. So I'm there with the rest of the shell and Windows in general, as well as Surface and some other things.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. All right. All right. Now, I think what I would like to do to start off, and it has become a bit of tradition on the show, is to give a bit of background on our history and our interaction over the years. Now, I had to look this one up. It goes back to about 2012, and it was we met on a Gearslots thread of all things.
Yep.
And then the Gearslots thread was in respect to comparative performance of Windows 7 versus Windows 8.1. Now, I do want to stipulate it was Windows 8.1, not Windows 8. Now, the reason that's important was that I had already done a stack of R&D on Windows 8 right through the beta period into the release. And I did the comparative performance using my own DAWbench sessions, and I didn't see any performance variable, so to speak. So Windows 8 didn't perform any worse, and it didn't perform any better. So I'd signed off and pretty much signed out of Windows 8, not because of the performance aspect, more because of the user experience that it was delivering. Right. I wasn't happy with it. I didn't want to pass it on to my clients. So, and there wasn't really a good vibe around Windows 8 at the time. So I'd actually signed out. And so this thread had popped up, and it wasn't created by me. It was created by another member there that was, quite technically proficient. And he'd used my DAWbench test sessions. Now, why the thread was interesting was that it had presented a performance variable between Windows 7 and Windows 8.1, where 8.1 was performing significantly worse, which was
interesting.
Which was very different, yeah. And the other interesting aspect on that thread was that there was also some discussion about a DAW developer that was presenting data that Windows 8.1 was delivering double figure performance improvement. So
yes, I remember that.
Yeah. So let's just say there wasn't a consensus. So I was being the developer of DAWbench and doing all the previous testing. I was actually asked to do some testing just to see whether we can get some clarity to it. Now, I reran all the tests in 8.1. They came back exactly the same as what I did with Windows 8. So there was another variable, and I think this is where you entered because we discovered that the variable was I was using a PCIe interface. The other fellow was using a Firewire interface, and what we discovered was that there was a change at the Firewire stack.
Yep.
And the native driver, for whatever reason, was falling on its ass. And in the past, with Windows 7, if there was a problem with the native Firewire driver, you could use the legacy Firewire driver. This wasn't happening in Windows 8 because every time you tried to force back to the legacy driver on reboot, it would move back to the legacy. Move back to the native, and so there was a big problem with FireWire interfaces, and that's where you entered the building. Now, do you remember much of that?
So I remember the FireWire issues. I don't remember a whole lot of the discussion, but I do recall around that time frame that changes made, and maybe a little bit before that, the changes made to the FireWire driver to better support the way like everybody else was using FireWire, which was, connecting video cameras and things like that, which had an adverse impact on DAW usage and pro audio stuff. So that's why you'd have to roll back to the legacy driver. And I remember some discussions internally where it would keep rolling back to the quote unquote, I'm doing air quotes here, you probably can't see them, proper driver, because the old one was no longer supported, and we're always trying to do things to fix the system for the kind of the regular user, and that caused all sorts of problems with folks doing FireWire for DAW stuff. I don't remember a whole lot about the conversation, though. I should really go back and read it. I'm sure it was lively.
Yeah, no, we had some interesting exchanges. It was all very respectful, but let's just say that we didn't land on the same page.
Right.
And it was not over the performance aspect. It was more I was voicing my, let's say, disapproval of the change in the user experience. And we can cover that.
Oh, yeah.
We'll cover that in more detail further. Further on. So what I do want to do now, though, is it would be great if you give us an overview of your personal history, your interest in music tech, how and when you landed at Microsoft, and how you ended up becoming the conduit for the DAW audio and music community.
Sure. Talking about myself is no problem here, right?
Right.
Although it's weird, like 2012 was 8 years ago.
Yep.
It's hard to believe it was 8 years ago, but it was. This is the first time we've done a podcast together. So it took 8 years, but I think this is going to be fun.
Yeah, but I mean, during those 8 years, behind the scenes, we've built a good friendship and a professional working relationship. And look, that might be a huge surprise to some people listening in who think that we're always at loggerheads if they see our exchanges online.
Yep.
But I like keeping them guessing, Pete.
Sure.
So, but we've developed a good friendship over the years, but yeah, it is crazy. 8 years. Yeah. Sorry, I digress. Where were we?
No worries. So personal history.
Yep.
So I'm going to go way back for a second, if that's okay.
Yeah, go.
I first. When I was growing up, we didn't play a lot of music in the house, right? So I didn't really get exposed to much music until I was in middle school and started going to the store and buying tapes myself, right? But what really got me into electronic music, which quite honestly I'd never heard before, like my dad was always playing talk radio in the car.
Mm-hmm.
There was never any music with that.
Right.
It was the Commodore 64s that we had in my junior high school or middle school, as other people call it, where you would load up a game and it would always have this really cool intro music as part of the game.
Yep.
And I'd never heard anything like that before. And before that, I'd honestly had no idea that computers could be used to make music. So I started, I really got into that. I was listening to all these different games, and it used to drive my friends nuts because they'd want to play the game, and I would sit there and want to listen to the intro music looping for a while, right? And they're just like, just get on with the game, skip the intro stuff. No, this was more fun. And so I got into learning how to program the SID chip, which was the hybrid analog digital synthesizer chip that was inside the C64.
Yep.
And this was 7th grade. Computers were still new to pretty much everybody. This is something that my friends and I would stay inside during recess, back when they actually had recess at that age, and learn to do this. So I was never advanced on it. I was never doing like assembly language program, but I learned enough to be able to do some cool things and learn about filters and kind of waveforms and learn how that all works. And that really got me into synthesis in general. And so, fast forward a little bit there, and my first My first keyboard I bought, I think I probably got at Toys R Us. It was a Yamaha Portasound. And then I relatively quickly traded that into a local music store and bought a used Juno 106, right? So it was actually the HS60 version with the super beautiful speakers.
Awesome speakers on those. Yes, I remember those.
People hate on that synth, but I actually liked the way it looked at the time. Now, looking back at it, it's kind of cheesy looking. I prefer the bright colors on the 106, but still it was a 106 and I didn't have to buy a separate set of speakers, so I could just plug other things into it as I needed.
Sure.
So I worked there, so I got that, and then they offered me a job shortly after I bought that. They're like, hey, you know something about synthesizers? Why don't you come work for us? And
what year was that? What year was that, Pete? Sorry.
This was probably around 1988 or so.
Okay.
Somewhere around there.
Yep.
And so I worked at that music store for a couple of years. And one of the things I liked is I got an employee discount. So I got stuff at cost plus shipping.
Of course.
Which was super nice. And now I was, a poor student, so I couldn't get all the really cool things I wanted, right? But I also got to play with all the stuff they had in the store. And I got to take things home over like a Sunday because we weren't allowed to be open on Sundays for a while there until the laws changed. And so I got to mess with things like I brought home one of those 4-track Tascam Porta Studios.
Yes.
Yeah, and I had a load of fun with that because before that I was just playing with recording everything on this like really cheap department store boombox that I had in my bedroom. And this was like being able to do multiple tracks. This was a completely different experience. It was super fun. And so I did that. I would bring home equipment to learn it and everything. And then eventually I bought a Passport MIDI interface from my Commodore 128 that I got in 10th grade.
Yep.
And that really opened up a lot of things because now I could use my computer to sequence the synthesizers I had.
And what was the software in the Commodore? I wasn't really familiar with that. I knew the Atari and Amiga had software. I wasn't familiar with what the Commodore had available.
So this had something called Master Tracks.
Right.
Which I've been trying to find screenshots of it, but I can't.
Right.
Okay. There were later versions of it for Windows, and actually you could still buy it as best as I can tell. And it talks about how great it is for MIDI sequencing and stuff. But this was really just using these just as a sequencer.
Right.
And so that made it so I could have more than one piece of equipment where I could play one and sequence some other stuff. And that opened up a whole lot of things where, because I had returned the Porta Studio after using it over a weekend. I couldn't buy it at the time. It was just used stuff and they were far more interested in selling it to other people than to me. So I had no way of doing sort of multiple sounds. But then when I started sequencing on the Commodore, I was able to do that again.
Yep.
And I could just pipe everything in through the speakers on the 106 there and kind of have all sorts of fun with that.
Yep.
And so I also borrowed from my high school. So my high school had a few synthesizers. Yamaha obviously went there and did some kind of a sales thing with them. And they bought these synths and they'd always just sit in a closet that nobody would use.
Oh, great.
So in school, I was able to use a DX7 in high school that they had there, and they had one Mac, and that Mac happened to have a MIDI interface built in for who knows what reason, because nobody was using it. Nobody even knew it was there. And so I was able to sequence that, the DX7 and play around with that. Now, I couldn't bring the DX7 home. One, it weighed as much as I did. And two, it just I wasn't going to borrow that over the summer. But they did let me bring home what was it? The DX100, the little one?
Yes. Yep.
With the tiny keys.
Yep.
So I was able to borrow that over the summer. Plus they had this old Akai sampler that used those mini discs that were used in typewriters and stuff.
Is that the one? The black and
black
blue?
And red, I think.
Oh, black and red.
But it had two different units. Like one was the disk drive and one was the sampler itself.
Yes, I do remember it. Yep.
Right. And it was so much fun because the sample time was so small that they just used two little sliders to control like the loop points and stuff on there. Like, you only had a couple seconds, so it was super easy to do that. so I had a ton of fun with that. And I was able to borrow that for an entire summer, which for me now, a summer goes by really fast. But when I was in high school, a summer it seemed like years of time to play around with stuff. So that like really got me into synthesis. And then I was selling musical instruments at the store. So I also got to try and, I learned about the Korg synths that we had, the Roland synths. We weren't a Yamaha dealer, but I got that from school. But, we were selling D50s and a bunch of other stuff over the time. Remember the JD800 was one that came out a little bit later.
I own a JD800.
Yeah, I've got one too with a replaced keyboard, because remember that glue issue that over time.
I have a brand new keyboard assembly sitting in a box, Pete. I still got. So I haven't replaced it yet, but I will eventually. Yep.
I replaced mine. Those you can't get them anymore. Roland was selling them for a little bit, and it's actually a really nice key bed. Like I didn't realize how mushy the keys were until I installed that.
Yeah. Well, on just on those key bed, I've been sitting on this thing for about. Well, I'm embarrassed to say, probably over 10 years, and I've got one for my D70 as well. They're sitting there. I've just got to get around to refurbing some of the synths I've got in the studio. I will eventually.
The 800, especially if you had the strings card to it, is just so nice.
I love it. I've got a couple of JD 990s as well, so I love it. The JD engine was my favorite. Next to my JP8, but we're going deep into another rabbit warren. Yep.
But I couldn't afford one of those back when I worked at the music store. There was, I forget what it was going for, but it was like $4,000 or something like that.
Keep going. It was closer to $7,000 here, and think of $7,000 in dollar terms in Australia back in the early '80s. But I owned one, but I almost had to sell a kidney to buy it.
It's arguable that it might be worth a kidney. I don't know. It's especially if it comes with one of those waveform cards.
You don't want to see not the JD8. I'm talking. I'm talking about the JP8. The JP8 was ridiculous. The JD800 early '90s. It was $5,000 here.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah. And that was just when I was like at the end of my time at the store. So I would sell synthesizers, but I also did all the menial stuff. I learned how to tune hundreds of guitars over the course of a week, and strings, and they would have me do the guitar tech stuff that wasn't like serious guitar work. Mm-hmm. Like I could straighten a neck and restring a guitar and stuff like that. So anybody who brought their things in to do that, because I was cheap, I was 17, 18, 19 years old, depending upon when. Yep. And their guitar tech was super expensive. So they would always use me for the cheap stuff.
Yep.
And let's see. So I didn't do any sequencing or any other work for a while I was in college and first starting my career. I still had the master track stuff. I did a little bit of that on the Commodore, but I didn't do any DAW stuff until probably late Vista or Windows 7.
Wow, that's a big jump.
Yeah, I really didn't do anything. I was just doing everything. I guess now it's a thing, right? It's DAWless messing around, right? But I never recorded any of that stuff or anything. And quite honestly, I was getting established in my career. I tended to do a lot more just straight up computer stuff than that.
Yep.
And then I joined Microsoft in 2009.
Yep.
And I was hired to teach people how to do client development programming. And then I quickly got in front of some of the folks who were on the MIDI team, and I was showing how to do some interesting things with MIDI on Windows, and that kind of brought me back into connecting things up more and starting to get more into DAW usage. And that just kind of grew over time. And then I started working with the partners that we have for Pro Audio, all the DAW developers and the hardware developers and stuff. And it wasn't really part of my job, but I was having some success with speaking with these folks, and they were happy to have a single person that they could talk to for that. So I was able to continue doing it, and it's just been made part of my job since then, because I have fun doing it, and the partners seem to agree that it's a useful function. And so I keep doing with that, and I still stay, I think, probably much closer to the MIDI side of things than the audio side, but I do both of those.
Yeah. And look, and that is great that Microsoft does have a direct liaison Now, I'm not sure whether Apple have. I would think that they would, considering that they've got Logic there. So they would have to have someone there that would be talking directly to the developers. But they're not as visible as what you are, for example. I mean, you're engaging and interacting with the community quite visibly, which is not something I see from the Apple side. That's not to say that they don't have some type of connection with their developers.
Like Tori on the MIDI side is a great person at Apple who works with developers and stuff. But I haven't seen him brave Gearslutz yet. So
yeah, well, he might, but he might be under a cyber cloak of some description. He might be hiding under in the shadows there. Now, one thing I do want to cover is your synth cave, because you have a synth cave, Pete. And the reason I do want to bring that up is that in our discussions leading up to this podcast, we were discussing not only the level of hardware that you're still using, but the number of MIDI interfaces that you have interconnected. And that kind of blew me away, the number of interfaces that you've got connected to the system, all connected to your hardware. So you don't have to go giving away the whole farm, but can you give us some insight on the level of MIDI interconnectivity that you are actually currently running, which I found quite intriguing, actually.
Yeah, I like to surround myself with things that are inspiring to me. So I do use all this equipment, just not all at once. Like, folks often ask me if, like, do you use everything in there? It's like, well, not on each thing that I do. Right. But I do use a lot of it. And I have, I'm trying to look. So I have 4 Motu 424, 4 Motu 24IO PCIe connected audio interfaces. So that gives me 96 inputs and 96 outputs. That actually really good latency.
And that's running off one single 424 card, correct?
Yes. Yeah. And that maxes out the connectivity.
That was a fantastic system from Motu.
I mean, they haven't updated the driver in forever, so I know it's going to stop working someday, but it's still absolutely an amazing, like, I haven't seen anything else short of some of the RME stuff maybe that will give me that level of IO and performance at the same time.
But not in the same manner. That was kind of unique because they kind of use it. It's like, is it a Firewire cable that they use for the IO interconnection?
It's not Firewire, but it's a Firewire cable.
It's a Firewire cable, but the protocol is not Firewire. That's what I was meaning. Yeah, the RME stuff is phenomenal as well. But I mean, they're using more conventional type of connectivity. whether it's MIDI. MIDI would be the one where you get into the larger IO. They did have a single interface PCIe to a single 8-channel interface that was running on a Firewire cable, but again, it wasn't a Firewire protocol. So, sorry. So, you've got a stack of IO. Yep.
Right. And then I've got, I think it's 6 of their 120, I forget the exact name. Was it MIDI Express 128? Had to look over my head here.
I've got one of those, but I got one of the old, it's not USB. It was the pre-USB one. It's basically just sits there and it's a dust collector.
Right. Yes. It was serial, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It had an actual serial.
I think I might be able to still connect it to an old P3, but I can't connect it to anything modern.
My motherboard has a serial port header on it. Now it's probably piped through USB. I've just never
it's actually serial. I mean, they are. If you can find a serial header, the only reason I haven't even attempted that Motu is I've got a feeling that it stopped working at some point on that serial connector for me. So I kind of moved on. So how many of those? You got 6?
I think I've got 6 of those, and then I've got 2 of the new iConnectivity rack units as well, which those aren't fully used yet, but they're interesting. They're the ones that have like a built-in like hub and let you, like both of these let you do, or more the iConnectivity one lets you do a lot of like persistent routing and stuff, but I don't use any of that. It's just all like MIDI I/O to the DAW.
That's a lot of MIDI I/O, mate.
So that's just the DIN stuff, right? And then I've got all these USB synths that are connected directly to some of the kind of high-end hubs that I have, to the point where I did actually max out the number of USB devices on my system as a whole, not just for synths, but I do embedded programming and a lot of other stuff for work. And I had something like 90 devices total connected up.
Well, I can't even fathom that. And I mean, one of the questions when you were first telling me about the number of MIDI interfaces that you had on there, or the USB devices, I'm like, well, how the hell are you actually managing these? Because you can't do it through a standard hub, and you do have some pretty high-end hubs. And they're, what are those hubs specifically? What's the original target market for them? Because it wouldn't be for media.
Right. These were they mount on like DIN rails for industry, I guess.
Yep.
They're I forget the brand name of them. I've got it around here somewhere. But they're 16 ports of I/O on it, and you know the target audience because they actually have the connections that you can screw your USB cable into and keep it like permanently there.
Yeah. So
they have the little like screw jobs on the side, and they have fans that are built into them. But because I don't use these to deliver power, I just unplug the fans so I don't have to hear them.
Of course.
But I opened them up, and the engineering inside these, the way that they make sure that you get the maximum bandwidth, is amazing. It explains why they cost a couple $100 each.
Well, I'd be thinking they'd be worth more than that.
Well, that's used, right?
Yeah, there would have to be some pretty high level of controller and manageability because, I can't even fathom that. I know that I've got clients that have got some powered hubs that might have an extra 8 USB, and they cause problems. And you're sitting there with how many? 80 odd devices. So that's a discussion we're going to. I think that's another rabbit warren we'll go down at a later date.
So it's interesting to me because I went and then listed out all these interfaces because folks are always coming back to me saying like, oh, Windows only lets you have 10 MIDI devices, which is not correct. It's a misunderstanding of a kind of an old limitation that we had. But I was like, I list all these using a little Juice app that I wrote, and they're all visible. They can all be seen and they can all be used.
Yeah. Yeah.
And performance is good. It's just MIDI, right? So if you have a good hub, I try to be smart about not putting things that are going to be in contention with each other on the same kind of bus.
Yes.
And I specifically bought a motherboard that has a lot of directly connected USB ports, so I can split this up in a sort of smart way. I won't say it's perfect, but it's somewhat smarter. And it works really great. Yeah.
Well, I mean, audio interfaces definitely like to have the bus free from anything else. Even if you've got two USB ports, and you've got the audio interface on the bottom one, and if you put something else directly above it, I mean, sometimes it works, but it can interfere. I've seen it where it interferes, and the easiest fix was just remove whatever you've got above your USB interface and put it elsewhere, and that tends to fix a lot of the kind of random odd things that have appeared when they weren't there previously, for example. So USB's always been a little bit of a crapshoot.
It's good, but I don't have any high bandwidth things. Like I deliberately don't have a USB audio interface because I have so much other stuff on here. I just don't need that contention in the system.
Well, you've got a PCIe. I mean,
and I have a video capture card that I use for recording like other stuff because this is my main PC that I do pretty much everything on. And that's PCIe as well. I didn't go with USB for that for the same reason.
Yeah, no, of course. Look, and the thing is that, and I've discussed this numerous times, even specifically and in greater detail with Matthias on that earlier podcast, that once you've used the PCIe audio interface, and it doesn't matter how good the other protocols are, whether you've got FireWire or USB, Thunderbolt's getting close, but it's still not the same. It's not quite the same. Even though it's external PCIe, there is still some additional arbitration going on between that. So as much as people like putting their hand up and saying, oh, but it is exactly the same as PCIe, it isn't. Not when you get into the nth degree of loading these machines up. And the PCIe interfaces, for those that have used them, know exactly what we're talking about. For those that haven't, they need to get in front of one and push a machine to the point where the graphics have stopped. Literally. Right? The graphics have stopped. You can't move the mouse. The meters have completely balked. Everything's stopped and the audio's still going. And you're going, well, what the... And that's because of the bus mastering and a whole stack of other stuff, So very, very clever stuff.
I don't expect a lot of people are building new systems with PCIe cards today. No. But if they do, it's like one thing I did learn with the Motu stuff I had is, the slot you use matters.
Of course it does.
Right. So because, we see these in the forums a lot where they're talking about they're getting glitchy audio when they happen to be using a PCIe card or something. It's like, well, did you try changing the slot? Because certain ones share bandwidth with like SATA devices or whatever, and that makes an enormous difference.
Of course it does, and that's why platforms, the high-end workstation class platforms, like something like an X299, where you've got 48 PCIe channels, running directly to the CPU. Now, if you can plumb mission-critical PCIe devices directly to the CPU, because there's no way, what are you going to use those 48 channels for? You've got a graphics card, you might be using some PCIe storage devices, but it's pretty tough to blow those channels. Where on the smaller platforms, the Z390 and even I'm not sure how many PCIe channels are hanging off the AMDs on the actual chipsets themselves, but all of those are actually sharing devices. Right. So you've got to be really careful if you're using those PCIe slots with something that is going to be, making those mission critical calls. So, I agree 100%. You have to be very, very careful with the PCIe slots, but that's kind of a given for anyone that's really kind of dealt with this type of stuff, Now, that was awesome, Pete. That gives us some really good insight that just because everyone knows you as Pete from Microsoft, the voice of Microsoft on the forums, but that gives people an insight that you've got a huge vested interest away from Microsoft in the music and the technology, and I think that is important for people to know, that you're not just someone putting the voice in for Microsoft when needed.
Yeah, because it can seem like you're a marketing person, or I'm a marketing person sometimes, and I'm not. And I really try not to be. I mean, we do have to toe the line on some things, of course, but I try to speak from my own experience as much as possible. Yeah,
well, I mean, you have a genuine interest away from Microsoft, so you have to put your Microsoft hat on, obviously, but this shows that you have a genuine interest away from it and a passion, like all of us. So that's awesome, and I think that is going to serve you well communicating with the actual community and the developers, because you are coming from a position of knowledge of actually using this stuff. So that's one of my frustration with some people when I've tried to communicate issues that I've had with drivers, for example, and you're talking to a driver developer that's not a musician. They're just a code guy, and I've had some responses saying there's not a problem with the driver; it meets Microsoft specifications. That's as far as his commitment. It meets Microsoft specifications. I went, okay.
I'm always having to go around inside and explain to people why adding a couple milliseconds latency actually matters. And you're right. If you're not a musician, you don't get it, because the musician community is super small compared to, say, gamers.
Yep.
And when it comes to gaming, it's all about frame rate, right? And so the audio is honestly secondary. And as long as it's playing in sync, nobody cares about, a couple of milliseconds of latency or something like that. No. Half the time they're wearing wireless headphones or something anyway, right? But for pro audio stuff, that's something that makes a huge difference for us all. So it's interesting trying to see different perspectives on that internally and explaining to folks why some of these things are super important to us.
Yeah. But look, and again, you can tell when someone is actually a user and has some level of understanding of the practicality of what they're coding, and others that are just they'll pull it meets specification card, and that's about it. And and you can always tell. Anyway, I think that's awesome. I think we should move on.
Sure.
And the whole focus of the show is windows and doors. Yeah, pun intended. And 25 years in the making. Now, the reason I've said 25 years, and that's simply because my experience started at Windows 95, and that's kind of mind-blowing enough as it is that I've been dabbling with the Windows platform for audio for 25 years.
Windows 3 for me, but not so much on the audio side there.
Yeah, I had a bit of a poke around at Windows 3, but I was really invested in the Atari. And then around that 1995, and I've kind of detailed this further in other podcasts, I won't go too far into it, but it got to that point in the middle 90s where audio was starting to move into, music production on the computers was starting to move into audio. The Atari had a Atari Falcon, which really, it was a dead end because Atari had pretty much dropped the platform. Right. And so I needed to move, and it was a Mac or PC. You didn't have the money for a Mac, and PC it was, and here I am 25 years later. But traveling down memory lane with these operating systems, 95 and 98 was an interesting area for me because I was learning a lot on my feet back then. And all my colleagues and friends, they had their arms crossed, they were Mac-based going, "Are you insane? What are you doing on the Windows?" I'm going, well, I'm like a dog with a bone. I've decided I'm going to give this a bit of a shake. I'm going to see how good I can make this. And I got very, very good at it. So by the time we reached Windows 98 SE, which, 98, I think I was using 98 right up into at least 2001. So that last iteration of 98, I was using a thing called 98 Lite, which was a little application developed by an Australian developer here that would essentially allow you to unbolt components of Windows. And using that, I could get my 98 installed down to, it would boot into 12 megabyte of RAM, Pete. I mean, 12. Yeah, it's just nice. 12 megabyte of RAM. Those machines, they were running on IDE drives. They had maybe 256 megabyte, maybe 512 megabyte of RAM total. The thing would boot into 12 meg. It would boot up lightning fast. You'd get into whatever the DAW was at the time. I was using Cubase back then. It was liquid. It just felt like an embedded system.
Which is funny. The 286 that I started with, that was the first PC I bought, and the last one that I bought that I didn't build myself. Had 2.5 megs of RAM.
Yeah.
And the 486 I did after that, I was, I really kind of splurged when I built it, and I think I put 8 megs of RAM in it.
Yeah.
And I was running, Windows 3 and stuff on that.
Yeah. I can't remember the exact amount of RAM. To be quite honest, it might have been 32. I think 32 would have been, but I do remember the operating system ran about 12.
And it was megs, not gigs.
Megabyte.
For the kids listening in, right?
Yes, so. MB. But those little 98 machines, they served me very, very well because AAVIM technology started in 2001, but officially, where I went out on my own. But the company had been around since about 98. So I'd been doing a whole stack of work with those Windows DAWs, working at another professional audio place. And then when I left and went out on my own, hit the ground running 98. So I kind of skipped Windows 2000, right, which was interesting, right? So, and the reason I skipped Windows 2000, I dabbled with it. The reason I skipped Windows 2000, there was something going on with the MIDI side of it, the MIDI timing side. Can you remember that, Pete? There was something going on with the MIDI timing side that didn't allow me to make the move to Windows 2000.
Yeah, so I went the NT route. I went from 95, and I don't remember running 98, but I knew lots of people did. Then I went like NT4 in 2000. And the NT side of things which some folks may not realize. Like, it's a completely different heritage, whereas the 95 and 98 and to some extent Windows ME, those were all based on the kind of DOS code, right?
16-bit, 32-bit hybrids. Yeah. Yep.
And they basically ran over a different operating system. Whereas the NT side, that was designed more originally for servers and being portable across multiple different types of processors and all the things that the 99X side weren't. And so if I remember correctly, NT and 2000 were the ones that really introduced these kind of hardware layers that were between the drivers and the operating system. And I can see where that would have affected the MIDI timing for that, although I wasn't using MIDI on 2000 at the time.
Right. Okay. So I look, I was far more versed in what the problem was back then, because I remember following the threads and it was enough for me to say I can't deploy the client systems with that. So
and 2000 and like NT and 2000 were, for the time, really heavy on requirements. Like you mentioned, you could run 98 on a pretty small system, but if you tried to run NT or 2000 on that same thing, you were really going to feel it.
Yeah, no, definitely. And look, the only time I kind of touched NT, it was NT4, and it was an early Pro Tools. When they first ported Pro Tools to Windows, and it was running on NT4, and I don't have a good memory of it. I was working as professional. I was working at the professional audio place, and we were a huge Pro Tools deal owner. Obviously, it was predominantly Mac, but they were saying, "Hey, look, we've got a Windows version," and then one client put his hand up and going, "Oh, I want to run this thing on Windows," and I remember the NT4 experience. It wasn't good. And the only other DAW I can remember on NT back then, I think, was Soundscape. Now, maybe it might have been 98, but I have some recollection that I think Soundscape was running on NT as well. And those things are almost embedded systems, the Soundscape systems, So NT4,
and that's the right OS for something like that, but just consumer-wise, it not so much.
Yeah, and look, I remember dabbling with what was then called NT5. All right, so NT5 morphed into 2000. So I was on it, but it wasn't paying out for me. It wasn't working out. So not paying out. It wasn't working out for me. So I stayed on 98 right up until XP. So XP is essentially NT 5.1. They just kind of renamed it, and then they put that they put that user interface that looked like Teletubbies on it, and
it totally did.
It did look like Teletubbies, and I hit the ground running with it. I thought it was awesome. And one of the first things I did, being a kind of a visual type of guy, and my 98s didn't look like 98. I had skins on my Windows 98. Yeah. And my XP, I actually developed my own custom style that was it was inspired by Ubuntu, right? So it was a charcoal looking thing. It was like a cross between Ubuntu and OS X. But I developed that whole XP style myself. Don't ask me how long it took me, but it was awesome. And the thing that it gave a consistency to the GUI, and in the DAWs it looked fantastic. So when I moved to XP, I went, okay, I need something similar, and then I sat down and did another one in XP, and that whole theme. Anyone who's bought any of my systems, the Windows 7 theme looks almost exactly the same as my XP theme. So there's someone who's been with me since 98 to XP to Windows 7. They fire the machine up for the first time. I go, bloody hell, is this the same thing? It isn't. Yep. I've just maintained a consistency to it. I haven't done it with Windows 7 simply because they've gone back to a nice minimal type of look. But but XP was great. I mean, from 2000 and I was right on board. 2001, I reckon I ran XP right up until Windows 7. So that's like what? So we're looking at
Yeah.
9 years. Is it 9 years? Yeah, 9 years.
XP was good because it was like 2000 was technically something that consumers could use, but really not really. But XP brought back like compatibility with games that 2000 lacked, and all the other things. And they also trimmed a bunch of stuff from 2000, right? So there was a whole bunch of stuff in 2000 related to security. I don't want to say we trimmed security, but I mean, like a lot of the domain stuff like was left out of XP, and a lot of the multimedia stuff was brought back. So here's a little tidbit: the Windows 95, the CD that it came with, it had that Weezer video on it, which was the first thing that was exciting to people to see a music video on the computer. But it also came with a couple of MIDI files that you can find on YouTube. One of them was called passport.mid. And I didn't realize until a couple of weeks ago that was made by the same people who made that Commodore MIDI interface that I was using back in high school. Right?
Yep.
So it was a Passport Commodore MIDI interface, and it's called passport.mid there. But the XP chain, I wasn't at Microsoft at the time, so I don't know what engineering happened between 2000 and XP, but it was obviously a lot to make it a more consumer-friendly OS, like lower requirements and everything.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the first one. It's the first one where they started breaking it up into different tiers, for example. So there was a XP Starter. I don't even know what XP Starter was, but I mean, there was Starter, Home, Pro, and there was also the 64-bit edition, which was for Itanium, right? So I'm just kind of...
And tablet edition.
Oh, sorry, I missed the tablet edition. But, it was the first one that you started getting these segmented type of versions. Not segmented, isn't it? What's the word?
Different SKUs.
Different SKUs, yeah. And for different levels. So that was the first one where I remembered where there was at least there was a differentiation between Home and Pro, And the 64-bit version, that's an interesting one because during that time, there was that whole... the CPUs were developing quite quickly, and AMD came out with the x86/64 extension.
Yep.
And they were the first onto the ship with the 64-bit stuff. And the operating, we didn't really start looking at that until around 2005, and that was XP Pro 64. Now, if you remember that was essentially Windows Server 2003. That's what it was,
right.
With some media stuff put back into it. Now, that was a great operating system, but I didn't have a large footprint with that one. Maybe a couple of years. I built some systems with it. Usually the dual Xeons with additional memory I was running on XP64, but the software hadn't really caught up yet. We were still using 32.
But that was around the time frame though when a lot of folks, it was recommended that if you wanted a more powerful system, like for software development or something, you would run the server product instead of the regular product. So I knew a lot of people that ran Server 2003 and Server 2000. But the problem, of course, is when you tried to add like a third-party antivirus or something, and they're like, yeah, we're going to charge you for the server version of this, which was, thousands of dollars for that.
Yeah. And just quickly on that, I do remember, I was dabbling with Server 2003, but turning into a workstation. So there was whole projects where we were dabbling with the 2003 kernel, but we were putting all the media stuff back on in the GUI, and it was essentially, I made it look like my custom XP.
And if you wanted more than one core, or a separate processor at the time, I don't think you had any choice. You had to go with the server product, if I recall.
Yeah. And just to go back on my point that I was making before was that we were still running 32-bit applications on those 64-bit OSs because the 64-bit stuff was kind of, the developers were
was slow.
Kicking and screaming into that. So that didn't really start kicking in until probably around 2006, I think. So moving on from XP.
But related to that, even today, the branches that we have for building 64-bit software. Like the 32-bit is just the folder's always named x86. The 64-bit's always named AMD 64, and that's true if I recall as well with the installation media and everything else. So that heritage goes all the way back there.
Yeah. So moving on from XP, we got Vista.
Which wasn't as bad as everybody says
after
a few service packs.
I know, but people tend to remember the first impression, right? Now,
which was not good.
No, it was not good. And I'm coming from XP64, and I remember when I first installed Vista, and I looked at it and went, "What is this?" And was Vista when the Aero was first introduced? It was, right? So they had that whole Aero thing. And it felt like sludge. I'm like going, what is this?
Yeah.
So I'm doing my best to optimize it and get rid of all of the baubles and all the rest of it, the widgets and gadgets and everything else that actually introduced at the point. And but just to try and get the GUI to respond like I could with XP, and then I was doing some performance stuff. And wow, that was, especially with Aero in those early days, Aero was just sinking DAW performance. And what was,
you needed the graphics drivers, so that they weren't out there yet.
Yeah, of course. But we didn't, we just went, well,
no, nobody knew. Your experience was just terrible.
What is this?
Yeah.
So, and I remember it was very interesting at the time because, again, there was a software developer that was claiming double-digit performance improvements, and there was also someone else that one of the DAW builders had presented a report that there was a marked improvement with Vista over XP, and I'm trying to replicate the results and I couldn't replicate them, and then we got to the bottom of it, and it got kind of heated because in the end that report was retracted, but 12 months later, so the damage was done. So there was no consensus on what the performance was. The majority of the DAW builders that I was conversing with just said, well, no, we're getting the same result as you. And I just, I stopped talking about it online because there was no point, So I continued with XP right up until Windows 7. Now, I agree with you that by the time Vista had reached Service Pack 2, it was okay, but Microsoft had essentially abandoned it.
Yeah, it was a new driver model, right? So that was the big thing. Everybody had to rewrite their drivers for it. And I know it gets a bad kind of rap from folks, but you couldn't have Windows 7 without having gone through Vista first.
Of course.
Otherwise, you would have just had the adoption and driver issue with Windows 7 instead of with Vista. And we look back at Windows 7 and think it was crap.
Yeah.
Right?
So Vista was, the code was NT6. So that was the first of the NT6 variants.
Yeah. But really being the first one that needed video hardware acceleration was really tough.
Yeah.
When I was trying out Vista during the beta period, because I wasn't working at Microsoft at the time, I tried running it in a VM, and that gave you the whole like lowest possible PC spec, no hardware acceleration experience, and that I wouldn't wish that on anybody.
Right. Well, look, with Vista and even with Windows 7 for quite a few years, which was interesting, I was using the basic mode. I was using basic, and the DAWs loved it, and it was quite a while before I made the shift to using the Aero driver. Now, because my visual style was completely different to the standard Windows 7, the basic looked exactly the same as the Aero. So visually, it looked like exactly the same. But
so you were one of the people that, like, if the machine wasn't yet activated, it would be like, oh, we're going to stick you only in basic mode. And you're like, yeah, that's fine.
Well, basic actually performed way better, especially, I'll give you one example. Pro Tools performed way better with basic. Even to this day, Pro Tools on Windows 10, Pro Tools 2020 on Windows 10, you fire up the GUI and it's still got these horrible looking Windows 7 basic window frames on it. Oh,
Cubase had that for a while too. They might still, I don't know.
I don't know if they do, because I ran custom.
Oh, true.
I ran those custom GUI, so I didn't know. But because Windows 7, I don't run a a custom visual style on Windows 7, it's just hit me in the face again. I've gone, wow, that's a beauty. All right, so yes, so Windows 7, that to me was the comeback. You know, Microsoft had spent some time focusing on the performance of it. So that's how I felt. It was a lot snappier, a lot faster straight out of the gate.
I would say there was a lot of stuff in there that folks didn't like. I know everybody looks back at 7 fondly, but that's where user account control and stuff really got into people's faces, and there were lots of negative reactions to a lot of those things. So it was a good operating system, but I think we need to look back at it realistically as well. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. We've had this discussion a few times. I don't remember that. I mean, I can only voice how I perceived it. User account control, big deal. Go in, disable it. Or not disable. Just pull the slider down. That was not a problem for me. And I remember those stupid bloody on a Mac, on a PC, where they've got the two guys standing there, and they're kind of making out that for you to do anything in Windows, there was always this guy interfering with interacting and stopping you from doing stuff, which I found quite ridiculous, in the sense that you try and install something on a Mac without typing in a password, you can't. So I mean, they were just as intrusive, and where on Windows you can disable it, on Mac you can't. But those ads, kind of
those ads I think caused a lot of changes down the pipe later on that we'll probably talk about here.
Right. Okay. So look, with Windows 7, that just hit the ground running. There was a wide range of versions as well, and it was interesting. So you've got the Home. There was 2 versions of Home, which confused me. So there was a Home Basic and a Home Premium, and then there was Windows 7 Pro, which is the one that I've always used. And then there was an Enterprise, and then above Enterprise there was an Ultimate. Now, what?
Yeah.
So I have got an Ultimate license, which is one of my media servers is actually running on.
That's what I ran as well.
So what was that? Can you remember? Was that like a Windows Professional with some enterprise features? I just couldn't.
If I remember correctly, that lets you log into domains and stuff on enterprise.
Right.
But this is marketing people gone wild is what it is.
Right.
Like, you really don't need that many different SKUs.
No. So we're going to move on to Windows 8. I've taken a deep breath.
Do we have to?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry, we do. And I've taken a deep breath, because this is where I felt there was a bit of a U-turn. So Windows 7, that was so good for the Windows community, not only the DAW, just in general. It gained a lot of respect from the professional audio community. It was great. So we get to Windows 8. I'm on the early beta. The first time I installed it, I'm not going to swear, but it was, what the is this?
Right.
And I've gone, okay, it's nice if it was on a tablet or a phone. What's with all these tiles? And I think I spent the first 15 minutes just trying to navigate around it. All right. So I'm on beta going, I don't think I like this. That's an understatement.
There are some people that are listening that probably have never touched it, so they don't realize, like, the start thing was a full screen set of tiles, like you said, that scrolled to the side. And then there was like nothing else. There was no, I don't even think we had a proper taskbar visible or anything like that.
I think there was was there a taskbar?
And I don't remember. And the apps were full screen.
Yeah.
And then there were like all these hot spots in the corners and the side that if you moved your mouse to, it did different things.
Yeah, there's things firing up. I think I spent 5 minutes trying to find the control panel. It was hilarious, right? So I just got, I don't think I can do this, But I spent some time with it, and then there was apps like Classic Shell, where you can hack a start menu back into it, and so I started working around with it even before Classic Shell, though, in the beta list, and this is when there was still a beta list. one of the guys posted up, he's saying, hey, here's a registry entry. I've spoken to you about before. It was hilarious.
Yes.
Here's a registry entry, and type in this registry entry, and you reboot the machine, and it looked like Windows 7. I went, everything was Windows 7. So there was a Windows 7 shell hidden under there. So what do you think happened in the beta list? Everyone switched back to the Windows 7 shell.
Of course, because the shell is just an application. So if they want to try out a new one, they put a switch in the registry. But I don't think the intent was to have everybody roll back.
To roll it back, right? So for me, it just proved that the whole Windows 8 thing was an overlay. So I think it was originally called Metro, and then they got into trouble with Metro, and they called it Modern. But to me, it was just an overlay. But the next beta build, they actually killed that registry entry, so we couldn't move it back. So I'd already done all of my testing right up to the release, and this is what I was mentioning earlier, where the performance aspect of it was fine, right? I would have loved to have used the kernel, because I think there was some improvements with storage driving. There was some improvements there.
There were.
But I wasn't seeing anything that I could quantify.
Earth-shattering,
Yeah, I couldn't see anything that I could quantify. So there was no reason for me to deploy that. I wasn't going to impose that on my clients. No one really wanted it. So we moved on,
It was a good start. So it did have a number of improvements under the covers that unfortunately were overshadowed by that shell. But I mean, the thinking at the time, and I'm not going to put myself in Sinofsky's head, but the thinking at the time is that, hey, the future of computing is more in mobile devices like tablets and stuff than it is with straight up desktops. And honestly, like, desktops are barely sold compared to the highly portable laptops and tablets these days anyway. And I don't necessarily agree with the approach, but I get where he was trying to go with it. And the idea of like sort of forcing people down this path is because we had touch support in Windows since Windows XP Tablet Edition that I mentioned earlier, but nobody was coding for it because they didn't have to. So the thinking was, all right, so if we sort of force this and make it so that applications have to follow this paradigm, then they'll do it. And then, then Windows 8 happened, and we saw how well that was received.
Yeah, and that kind of backfired. Look, they Windows 8 wasn't the only one. I used to use, I always dabble with my Linux stuff, and I loved Ubuntu, and it had the GNOME or GNOME or GNOME or however you pronounce it.
Yeah.
That GUI. Yeah. That's the one I actually prefer, and I still use to this day. So I'm still using like an Ubuntu Mate on my little Dell XPS thing that I travel around with.
I was doing KDE at the time, if I recall. Yeah.
But a lot of those Linux distributions, they essentially look like Windows, all right? And then Ubuntu come up, and then they had that really nice charcoal kind of cross between a Mac and Windows type of look, which I emulated on my 98 XP and Windows 7 machines. And then they tried to introduce, I can't remember what it was called now, but they tried to introduce a change to that whole user experience GUI. And it wasn't as tiled as Windows 8, mm-hmm. but it was these kind of icon-y based type of things. And collectively, the Ubuntu community went, what the? It's about the same time. And we went, no. And we were going back to what they called the classic, the classic GUI. And everyone went back to it, And then mm-hmm. at that point, you started seeing the rise of things like Linux Mint and all the rest of it. So I think it backfired on them, because a lot of people went, I don't like that, and they started going to the other distributions. So that was interesting. So, look, I kind of get it, of what they were attempting to do, but my qualm was always, and this is one of our early discussions, Pete, when you actually asked me on that thread, what is your main qualm with Windows 8? And I just said, well, the whole overlay. Why can't they just make it optional? Why can't they make it that if you were running on a tablet, that's the GUI. If you're not running on a tablet, just go back to a standard install. Now, a standard GUI. They did that in Windows 10.
They did, but remember what I said about sort of forcing developers down a certain path? The thinking was that if you didn't make it optional, they would have to support touch, because this was kind of survive or not type thinking from folks. They were looking at the future of computing, and then like, look, if we don't get people to build touch applications, things like the iPad are going to eat our lunch, right? And that's going to be the future, and that'll be the end of it all. Now, there's some truth to that, but I also think it was over. Like people, I think, went too far with their thinking of this, right? Because there are still desktops, there's still plenty of laptops that aren't touch even, and again, if it was optional at the time, everybody, you've seen tweak guides online, right? People just blindly follow them. And people setting up their computer for their father or their mother or grandparents or whatever. I was like, all right, here are the 3 things we're going to do. We're going to uninstall this, uninstall this, uninstall this. And it's like, why? And you find out, well, I read this on a tweak guide that some influencer said that this is a stupid thing, and so remove it. And we knew that nobody would ever have touch support. Now, I don't know that we solved for either way on that, sort of just irritating a lot of people with Windows 8 and eventually sort of pulling that back, getting rid of the executives involved, and going forward with something that's more like what you were asking for.
Yeah. Well, I mean, 8.1 was kind of was halfway there. You know, one of the arguments that I used to see online was going, oh, I don't even use a start menu. I said, it's nothing to do with the start menu. I mean, the start menu is an aspect of it. It's simply the familiarity. So Windows 8.1 dragged a lot of it back. It did drag a lot of it back. It just gave, there's a level of familiarity. The first version of Windows 8, for someone who'd been using Windows at that point for, 15 years more, I just went, I don't want this, And that's
Windows 8 got rid of Windows, right? So the name of the product is Windows, and you could not have Windows in Windows 8.
Yeah. It was kind of, look, I thought it was a huge misstep. And the thing is that one thing that with the Mac OS, OS X, now called Mac OS, you could fire up 10.0 and then fire up whatever the latest version is now, 10.15, whatever it is. And it's the same user experience, essentially, and they don't play with the familiarity for their end users. So that's what I think was the huge misstep with Windows 8. Again, 8.1, I did some installs with 8.1 for some, not for clients. I never deployed Windows 8 into DAW land, but I did some for some close friends. One, it was running a little NUC, and I didn't want to put Windows 10 on there because he's not overly technical, and he'd be just calling me all the time saying this thing's tried to update itself or whatever, right? So I didn't want to go there with Windows 10, so I put 8.1 on there. He was very familiar with XP, so I put classic start menu in there, and for him, he fired it up. It felt like XP, and it's been brilliant. It was a brilliant little unit, right? So for him, that was perfect. Yep. So I did see 8.1 in action. I could see that it was okay towards the end. The horse had bolted, pretty much like Vista. I call it Vista 2. The horse had bolted. Microsoft had pretty much abandoned it. So I was hoping for this TikTok type of release, where we had XP good, Vista bad, Windows. Vista bad. Windows 7 good, Windows 8 bad. So I'm hoping he comes to talk that Windows 10 was going to address all of the problems that they knew they'd made a mistake with Windows 8. And we're going to go back something more similar to Windows 7. So we're going to move on to Windows 10, Pete. Now, have you got your goggles and your gloves on?
Sure, I can take it. We've had these discussions before.
Yeah, we've had these discussions, and we've had these discussions online. But, I mean, Windows 10, and I was on very, very early, so there was no longer a beta, but, what do we call it now?
The Insider program.
The Windows Insider program, right? So I was on very, very early. And one of the things that was happening with me with Windows 10, and we know what the primary complaints are, which we'll cover. But for me, here I am at a developer mode real early, and I'd install my Windows 10, and I'd make a couple of little background tweaks, No third-party hacking or anything like that. Just a couple of background tweaks that I usually do, just some configuration stuff. And my start menu would break. There was no response on the start menu. Now, we've had this discussion going back 5 years, Pete, right? Because I remember saying to you, I'm going, I don't believe this, Pete. I've broken the start menu. And you'd be saying, well, what have you done? I'm going, I've done bugger all. And you're going, you sure you're not using those third-party hacks or anything? I'm going, no, right? And even to the point
that was a wonderful impression of my voice, by the way. Thank you.
No, sorry, man. I'm not very good at impressions.
We were going back and forth on a bunch of those things. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, the Windows Start menu, and I want to make that point because that broke my R&D for a period of about a year, right? So we were talking, I started pre-1507, right? So broken start menu. So I'd be, spending some time on R&D. I'd be doing some stuff. I'd reboot the machine, start menu's unresponsive. I'm going, here we go again, have to reinstall it again. Now that was getting pretty tedious, let me tell you, Yeah. So I left it. I'm going, okay, 1507 comes out. I'm going, surely. I'd actually left the Insider program. I couldn't be bothered because I wasn't getting an answer on it. And I'm going, this is the most fundamental thing for me. I can't spend more than 15, 20 minutes in this operating system without breaking the start menu. I can't continue with my R&D, and I'm not going to keep reinstalling it, all right? So I left it probably for about 6 months. Went to the release 1507. Sure enough, installed 1507. Guess what? Within 15, 20 minutes, I broke the start menu again. And we never got to the bottom of it, Pete, if you remember, right?
Now, I know there was some profile corruption stuff that was happening. It kind of resolved itself over time, but I don't think we ever found out that doing X was triggering this to happen.
But here's the interesting thing, right? And this is the point I want to make, right? So we got to 1511, and I love 1511, right?
Yep.
So we got to 1511, and I managed to get into some R&D without breaking the start menu and going, phew, right? But then I start reading some reports online on some of the tech forums or even on Gear Sluts on that Windows thread where people are going, I don't know what I've done, but I broke the bloody start menu, just broke. And I'm sitting back here literally laughing my head off. I'm going, And I remember you approaching it, and I didn't say anything online, but I'm messaging you going, all right? So I was going mad with the start menu. But I think they did actually drill down and find out what it was, Pete, in the end. It was...
But I think that was a different cause than what you were running into. Maybe that was the one with the profile corruption.
I wasn't doing anything. I was looking at the screen and maybe dropping a fart. Seriously.
Yeah.
I mean,
it doesn't like you.
And it didn't like
cause.
Yeah.
Root cause analysis. It just comes back and saying it's a VIN. Forget it.
Yeah, that's what it was. So, I mean, but that actually held up my Windows 10 R&D and deployment quite a bit. And then we started hitting the more serious stuff. All right. And this is why you got your goggles and your gloves on. And one of the principal things for me, everyone just says, the updates. But I mean, let's drill down a little bit further with that, right? The core problem with the updates for me, two of the core problems. One, I mean, the enforced updates was something that I actually managed to control, if you remember rightly, right? Because I discovered that group policy editor, I actually stumbled on it. And the way I stumbled on it was that there was all of these options numbered 1 to 5, right? And 2 to 5. Number 1 was missing. And that number 1 option on the group policy editor in the past was disable auto updates, right? And so that was missing in the group policy editor, right? And I went, okay, that's interesting. So I disabled it. And guess what? It returned that functionality. So all of a sudden I've got 1511 and I go into my Windows update menu and I had a screen that said, it had the Windows 7, Windows 8 screen that said disable automatic updates. And I took a screenshot and I sent you the screenshot and I think you thought I'd photoshopped it. I went, no, I've discovered a group policy hack. I'm not going to tell you what it is just yet, but it became more common knowledge, obviously. But so I had that under control, right? The second thing was the cumulative updates that's the thing that was really doing my head in because in those accumulative updates in those early days, if you remember, they were forcing graphics drivers, chipset, use anything, any of the hardware drivers. Now that's a no-no and a half, right? So if I finish configuring,
and this wasn't exclusive to 10 later on, right? So it's sort of a Microsoft-wide thing where all the previously supported operating systems were moving to these roll-ups.
Yes, later. But I don't know about hardware on those. But the thing is, on those previous ones, you still had an option of selecting, right?
Yep.
Now that was the other thing that they took away in 10, right? So we had no option of removing the hardware drivers out of the cumulative updates, right? So if you wanted to do security updates, fine, right? But don't go mucking around with my hardware. You know, if I've configured a mission critical DAW, the last thing that you want to be doing is mucking around with the drivers that I've put onto that machine. So that was the biggest qualm.
So that makes total sense to us. But then the way the update team would look at it is a number of those drivers would have security issues that needed to be resolved. And remember, we were talking a little bit about the old I'm a PC, I'm a Mac things. Like, I'm not going to say that they were directly responsible, but they were highly, like the attitude that conveyed was responsible for driving a lot of this, where if you didn't force people to update their system, they would end up getting systems that were owned by, you know, some botnet over in the Far East or something like that. And that would make press all the time, right? And people would lose data, people would have malware, all that kind of stuff. And so these changes being forced were in no small part because of that. And then also because a lot of our software partners really wanted to count on people having certain combinations of hardware and software that they could count on. Now, that's still a super hard problem to solve for because the PC ecosystem is really very open compared to, say, Mac. Mm-hmm. But they wanted to count on people being on a certain level of the operating system. And when they had that level, that meant that they had all these other things updated as well. Now, we can agree or disagree on whether or not that's a good thing. I have professional opinions as well as personal opinions on that. But really that was the intent behind that, is to stop the it just works stuff on Mac, and PCs are full of viruses and malware. So, we had to force people to update. But on professional machines, that would really cause all the issues you're talking about.
Yeah. My qualm with that thinking was that you've got Microsoft have various levels of Windows. So you have various levels of users. So
absolutely.
So to actually implement that at home, right?
Yeah.
For the
Makes
majority,
total sense there.
That 100%. Yeah. But when you market a product as professional and you start pulling back the tools where we can actually control the updates ourselves because we're smart enough to do so, we have the technical ability to do so, that didn't make any sense to me, So
now I agree with you on that.
Yeah, 100%, Pete, 100%.
Yeah.
And
I agree with you on that.
Yeah, and this has been an ongoing thing, right? So the thing where I got a bit squirrely and I probably started becoming more vocal on Windows 10 publicly because, look, locally amongst my friends and colleagues in the pro audio, they call me the Windows Avenger. Seriously, Pete, that's my nickname, right? I'd be the guy that would be the lone Windows user in a room at a product release surrounded by Mac users with their arms crossed, and I'd be the lone Windows guy that everyone would like to have a target on my forehead, right? So
somebody needs to draw you in an Avengers costume with like a Windows logo on his shield or something like that.
That'd be pretty hilarious. But, they haven't done that. But now that you've said that, there's probably going to be Vin memes.
Somebody who's listening.
Great.
Yes.
So for me to start being quite vocal against Windows 10 was that was not a small thing for me,
You were frustrated. And I think it should be clear to folks that there are lots of things that you can deal with as an individual, right? So like we see this on threads all the time where folks say, hey, these are not a problem for me. Why are they a problem for you? They're a problem for somebody in your position because you have to support all these other people that you're selling PCs to.
Correct. It's not only just me,
Right.
I've got a whole umbrella that I have to deploy and support.
So that's completely different from just me being able to deal with stuff on my own in my house.
Yeah, correct,
Yeah.
100%. So I think the thing that really triggered me was that I was very happy with 1511. Very, very happy with it.
We had a Thunderbolt 3 in that release too.
Yes. So 1511, highly optimized. I had my updates completely controlled, even to the point where, and I don't mind saying this now because they've broken these little apps, but I had a third-party app which would log into the Windows 10 update server, read the cumulative update, and break it up into individual packages for me. Exactly the same as Windows 7, Windows 8, right? Now, these were available for ages. Over the years, they've progressively, they've neutered them. But so 1511, I had complete control of my updates. I had individual control for my updates. And it was very, very solid, right? So no problems. Out comes 1607, and you know where I'm going with this. They purposely neutered that group policy editor entry, where they killed the whole idea of the automatic stopping the automatic updates. And that one blew my mind. I'm going, well, hang on, how many people realistically in the whole Windows 10 ecospace would be using that facility? And so why would they be? So for me, it felt like they were targeting, not me personally, but they were targeting those of us that had the technical ability to be able to simply change a group policy editor setting that was available. It wasn't a hack, right? It was just basically logging into the group policy editor, applying one of the official settings, and someone made a decision, right, that we'll leave the entry there, we'll just neuter it. That one really got me.
Right. And that was actually a bug, not a decision, at least when I talked to the update team about it. And that was for, I think, a couple of releases. But since hardly anybody knew about that entry, like it either wasn't being tested or just wasn't part of their initial stuff, there was a change made elsewhere that ended up breaking that. That's why it was still in group policy, but just not doing what you would expect. Because otherwise, like if the team was trying, and you know this from other things, if the team was trying to get rid of it, they would have actually just removed it from the group entry. Policy editor. Yeah. And so just so folks know, that's fixed and has been for a couple of releases now. So you can completely turn off updates through group policy editor and Pro now.
Yes. And that's one of the official fixes that we got across the line, which we can cover a little bit later. So that was my main qualm with Windows 10. So the other thing is that, and this is not something that a lot of people would be aware of, but there are performance differences between the versions,
Yes.
And some of them are very significant, but it has to be in a working environment. So like, for example, systems that have large numbers of I/O, live recording environments, 64, 128, whatever, right, for example. Those working environments were completely different compared to, say, like in 1511, where they were rock solid, to whatever, 1607, 1703, 1709, you pick, right? They were working completely differently in those type of environments. So 1511, for example, I ran that right up until 1709, right? And I've only signed off on one other version after 1709, right? So I'm not the person that sits there and jumps on every version. Now, even Windows 10, the 18 versions, one of those, it took about 6 months to connect the dots. I can't remember, was that 1809? There was one that by the time they officially signed off for enterprise use, had reached the release date of the next one. I think it was 1809.
Yeah. There was one of those, and I don't remember if that's the one that had the Spectre and I forget what the other Intel
the Chicken Little. I call him the Chicken Little. It might have been the Chicken Little.
But you had to fix them. because people are freaking out over it.
Yeah, I can't remember whether those mitigations were the direct, but I remember there was, I remember there was some serious problems with that release. So 1903 was the next release that I kind of landed on. And of course, the first time I tested it, and remember it was the what that, Pete, with the DPC latency.
Yes.
And you were saying to me, what have you done different? I'm going, I haven't done anything, mate. It's a fresh install.
I sound like a broken record. But so understand, like 90% of the things that I run into, and there's one thread which I know you were looking at, are people have made a bunch of random changes based upon stuff they read on the internet. Of course, and then they're like, yeah, my profile comes up black, or like there's like some issue here. So I always have to start with,
what have you done?
What have you done? Because, well, because you support customers, right? And so you might have a case where somebody calls you up and they're like, yeah, I can't like record anymore. And they're like, did you install anything? No.
Yes, they did.
No. And then you go and you look at it and you're like, oh, what's this new thing that was installed like a couple of days ago? And you're like, oh, I didn't think that mattered, right? So we have the same thing here. And I hate to always start with that, but so many of the cases really are, I applied random tweaks to the BIOS and to the PC here, and I thought that wouldn't, hurt anything. But yeah, this one wasn't that though. This was an actual bug that was introduced in 1903 that it was related to security. I don't think it was the same as the Spectre one.
No.
But it was related to security, and somebody made this change, and we actually had it reported internally from game developers. Like, when game developers are noticing DPC latency for audio,
there's a problem.
You know it's there.
Yeah, and interestingly, I was in Seattle last year, visiting some close friends there who actually work at Microsoft as well, Pete. So, I got the guided tour of Redmond, which is absolutely incredible. But I got to meet some of the core guys there, and I was talking to a kernel developer, who I was talking about this, this DPC latency problem with 1903, and he's just looking at me, he's going, and he just didn't get it, and I'm trying to explain. I'm going, but this is really detrimental to low latency performance on Windows DAW. He's going, but we're only talking a couple of microseconds. I'm going, we're talking more than a couple of microseconds, mate. Nanoseconds. We're talking. So he didn't quite get that. Once we got above 1,000 nano, it's all over Rover, But this thing was spiking. Oh, what was it, Pete? It was into the 3,000s, So here's my DPC.
It was like seconds in some cases.
Oh, was it? So I didn't see seconds, but I remember my DPC latency usually sits around 30 to 50 in real time's about 8 or 10 most of the time, and then it'll move up to 50 or 70. You might go up to 150. Again, it's not going to cause any problems. And all of a sudden, there was this huge red block, and it was 3,800 or something. I went, boy, we got a problem here. And so I rebooted the machine, checked everything, and it came back again. And that's when I sent you the what the is this. And we drilled down. It took them it took about 3 months to kind of fix it. So
the fix didn't go out until 1909. So
but there was a patch for 1903. I know because I used it.
That's right. There was.
Yeah. So 1903 has been very, very good for me. 1909 I've kind of dabbled with a little bit. I'm not going anywhere near 2004 because they've gone and made some changes again, Pete, with the update stuff, which when I read it, my eyes rolled in the back of my head and went, I can't remember the official wording is that we've made some changes to the Windows Update procedural thing about how long you can pause the updates because it was confusing people. I went, I'm not confused. Who was it confusing? So
I don't know.
It's very strange. I sometimes
I've had enough discussions with individuals on the update team, even specifically around that release, that now they're listed as like my top. We have these little graphs inside the company that tell you who your top collaborators are and stuff. and apparently the update team and I are best friends. So,
top collaborator, Pete and the update team. Oh, fantastic.
and I don't want to be. So personally, I don't like that change, but obviously there was some actual user testing done here, because whenever they say that it was confusing to people, it's because of reports on the feedback hub and actual user testing and stuff, where again, the music industry, like musicians and stuff, it's a fairly small industry compared to many others.
No, we wouldn't even be a dot on the radar.
Right. And not only that, like most musicians, we follow the Gearsluts threads, right? Most musicians are not super technical when it comes to their computer setup. It's part of the reason why Mac is as popular as it is. It generally, although we've also read the other threads there that explain where the sort of the distortion field is affecting folks, but generally it you don't have a whole lot of options and it just works, right?
Yeah. Well, kind of. That's always been the mantra, but anyone who's really has worked with it, because I've worked quite extensively with OS X. That's not true, but
as long as you hold off on updating to a new release.
You don't want to go. You don't want to use a point update, because then everything just breaks. But hey, everything just works. So you're going around in circles. Hey, now look, with Windows 10, it's not all negative. We've done some good collaborative work together in the background. Yeah. And there was three main things. One of them, which I've kind of taken a deep breath, because I've spoken to this quite extensively, but that was the multimedia class scheduler area that we were kind of blindsided by. And the reality, we were blindsided by it, because multimedia class scheduler service was around since Windows 7, or was it Vista?
I think it was 7 or Vista, one of the two.
I think it was 7, actually, right? Yeah. And can you, before I go on to my next point, can you explain to the people listening what the multimedia class scheduler service is?
So it's it helps provide. Let's see which level to discuss this. It helps provide an application threads that are optimized more for doing audio and video, like stuff where you're going to notice any sort of latency or anything like that. So it's a way of prioritizing things. Yeah.
It's tick for us. Right.
And there's timers involved and a bunch of other stuff. It's really kind of a core part of the multimedia system in Windows.
Right. So, and look, I remember very early when it was introduced, and I remember Matthias from RME actually approached me and said, look, we've put this switch into the driver, multimedia class scheduler switch, and it's in all RME drivers. People don't even know it's there. I think it's actually off by default, or is it on? I think it's actually off by default. And he said, look, we've actually implemented this. Can you actually run it via your DAWbench suite at all of the different latencies and tell us if you can get any variable? Now, this was kind of reasonably early on. It was Windows 7, probably Cubase 6, 7, somewhere around there. Mm-hmm. And I just reported back, no, not even a plugin. All right. So I said, it's there, just leave it as an option. So the multimedia class scheduler optimization for the RME driver is actually a tick on or off, right?
Yeah.
Now, I don't understand it at that code level, but all I knew is that, within the DAWs that I was testing and the testing environments, it wasn't making one iota of difference on Windows 7, right? So
yeah. It's optional, right? It's not something that developers have to use, but it's supposed to make things like perform better.
Okay. So, and I've also had some discussion at beta level. Actually, I can't discuss that too much because I'm under some type of agreement. But I have spoken quite extensively to some driver developers that were toying with areas of that multimedia area as well, right? So the thing that was interesting for me was that the DAW developers were obviously looking at that, went, hang on, that's a tick for us. And who invested? How heavily were they investing in it? Now, I know that Reaper's got some multimedia class scheduler protocols in there as well. I've spoken to Justin about it. But Steinberg were the guys that were really heavily invested in this. In the optimization. Now, we were completely unaware. Just, Windows 7, Cubase 9, there was no problem. We never encountered any problems. Then all of a sudden we got Cubase 9 on Windows 10, and then the reports started coming up, and really early on, I had a client that approached me that and he's about 3 systems in with me. So we had an X58 6-core Xeon type of system that I built for him that he'd been belting the hell out of. And he popped back up 4 or 5 years later or 6 years later and said, okay, let's get a bigger machine. So this time was a 12-core machine, Windows 10, later version, Cubase 10. And I'm getting phone calls from him saying, I don't know exactly what's going on, but I can't even record a single track of audio with this. Yeah. I'm running a couple of tracks of Contact. There was some other plugins. So whatever the combination was actually triggering this multimedia class scheduler problem. And we hadn't connected the dots yet of what was going on. And then as it developed further, then Steinberg have come forward and said, hey, look, we've got a problem due to the threading change that's been made with multimedia class scheduler service, because it's been moved from where it was originally on Windows 7 at whatever level that code was.
Yeah, and like the user space, yeah.
Yeah, down to the kernel level. And the change was, okay, now you've got 32 threads max.
Per process, yeah.
Per process, right? And every time process makes a call, it used 2 threads. So then all of a sudden we were down to 16, and Windows reserved 4. So we were down to basically 28 threads, and two calls. We're down to 14 logical cores max. Anything above 14 logical cores, this thing was tripping over itself. So that was the problem. Steinberg were completely blindsided. I don't know what the limit. Totally. I don't know what the limit was in Windows 7, Pete. But if there was a limit, we don't know, right? So, if let's just say 128, right? Because that was the number that we got for the the unofficial fix, which I'll discuss in a second. So when we encountered that problem and Steinberg came clean, we're like, well, Steinberg offered up this kind of hack where they just said, here, we're going to limit the number of logical cores that your machine can talk to 14.
Right.
The reason I'm laughing is I've got clients out there with 12, 14, 16 core machines, we're talking 24 to 32 thread. I'm not going to limit them to 14,
But so in Steinberg's defense, like you said, we kind of blindsided them with that.
Yep.
And this is one of those issues where somebody inside the company or some team inside the company comes up with a best practice, and that best practice may have been 8 years old, right? But it's not well communicated. And so the best practice was, don't allocate these threads individually, use the thread pool, right? And that's that thread pool gave you access, I think, to it wouldn't use threads the same way. So that the whole using 2 in each, if I recall, wasn't something that you'd run into with the thread pool. But that's to be able to make that change in your code. Threading is a core part of the DAW,
of
right?
course.
The way you allocate threads, the way that you would be required to change that requires ripping and replacing some large chunk of code. Now, the Cubase is old. I don't know how much code is carried over from really old versions, but I have to think that sort of core audio engine things and stuff like that have some history behind them. And so, making this type of change is just an enormous task for somebody like Steinberg.
Yep.
And it wasn't really fair, I think, on our part to be like, yeah, so we've made this change. You need to update your code here. This isn't something you can get done in a couple of weeks, right?
No, but it's not something you actually voice to them, because we're
we did later.
But we're all completely blindsided. So the thing is that they actually heavily invested in MMCSS optimization. There was no thread limit as such that they were going to be hitting. There's no ceiling they were going to be hitting. And then all of a sudden, Microsoft have made the change. There's a 32 thread limit, bang, and we're hitting these limits, and everyone's kind of backpedaling. So I wasn't happy with the Steinberg fix, because how am I going to sell high core machines to my professional Cubase clients? And I've got a lot of them, and they're all professional composers. They belt the shit out of these machines, Pete.
Right, they need those cores.
Of course they do, right? So you're not going to come to me and say, okay, I want a 16-core machine, and by the way, you can use, out of the 32 threads, you can use 14. I mean, that was just ludicrous to me. To me, it was anyway. So I wasn't comfortable with it. A large portion of my clients are Cubendo users. So as you know, we approached you as a collective. And when I say we, that's myself and the other guys that are part of my little, our little DAW PC group. And we said, okay, what do we need to do to approach the relevant code area, the people that are in charge of this code, to get this message across that what they've done has been extremely detrimental to what we're doing. And I wrote a couple of reports for you. I mean, it took us about 8 or 10 months, Pete. And I remember
it took a while,
you were going in and out of meetings and all the rest of it, and it was just like, it wasn't easy, trying to get this message across.
The hard part for people to understand, it was funny that the meetings generally went like this. It was, hey, this is messing up musicians who are using their PCs to do audio. And the argument back was, well, it can mess up performance for other parts of the system. And the argument back was, musicians in their DAW don't care about performance with the rest of the system. They just want the DAW to work really well while that's happening.
Yeah.
And like trying to get folks to agree that this is a different usage pattern than worrying about everything else in the system, was super tough.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, the question for me was, what was wrong with the multimedia class scheduler service at whatever level it was in Windows 7? I mean, that I suppose is the principal question. It's not one that you can answer.
In theory, it will perform a lot better as part of the kernel, but I don't know what any actual benchmarks look like there.
Yeah, right. But with the caveat of we're going to limit it to this ridiculous ceiling level,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, not ridiculous, but they put in this, they imposed a ceiling. How they come up with the ceiling, we don't know, right? So cut a long story short, took us about 8 or 10 months. And I remember you were saying to me, you're going, you know what, there's a relatively easy fix, but I can't give it to you. I'm going, what do you mean you can't give it to us? Just give it to us. You're going, I can't, right? So we had to go through the whole process. And then I remember one morning, I wake up and you've posted in our little group, and there's this registry code. It's just a code, right? There's no. It goes, this is what they're giving me, Vin. There's no instruction. I've gone, what? What is this? Yeah. And then there was some rudimentary instruction about, can you limit it to the number of threads depending on the number of the cores of the machines? I've gone, no, but there was an instruction where they just said no higher than 128, and I went, you know what? 128 it is, because I wasn't going to make separate registry patches depending on whether you had a 10, 12, 14, or 16 core. Right. So we implemented, I actually followed the instructions and it didn't work, if you remember rightly, Pete. And I'm like going, this isn't working. And one of the other guys went, hang on, I've been toying with this. And he moved one subdirectory, all right?
Yeah.
Or maybe I'd misread it. It wasn't 100% clear, but in the registry tree, we moved it into a subdirectory, and bingo, all of a sudden, there we go, 128 multimedia class scheduler threads. I'm running Cubase 9 with ASIO guard off, leaning on that real-time engine, it's threading across all the available cores. I went, beauty, So the instruction was, can't share this publicly, not that I wanted to, but I sent it to clients, fixed them straight away. Those machines just completely transformed.
Right. And I sent it to Steinberg and other DAW developers too. But you're right, I can't post it publicly.
Because it's an unofficial fix.
It's a workaround, and you've seen the limitations with that. And not only is it a workaround, but it's the kind of thing where if people just blindly follow it, they're going to wonder why other parts of the system don't perform well,
Yeah, but is there other parts of the system I haven't encountered any? But
not for your customers, but random person on the internet who uses their PC for everything. Supposedly there are performance implications.
Right, so that we don't know of, but there could be, right? So the thing is that that's why it can never be made public, right? Because then the random idiots, well, actually, no, there will.
It'll show up on a tweak list, and then everybody will blindly do it, and that's it.
And that's it. And then there'll be problems, But now the reason I call it an unofficial fix and you call it a workaround is that at the time we thought it was an unofficial fix until we discovered that you ran a Windows update and it said, what is that? That's a rogue entry, and it delete the entry. Yeah. So you did hand it to Steinberg. I wasn't overly happy with the way they actually approached deploying that to clients. They didn't do it in a very intelligent way. They could have easily just made a patch. That's what I reckon, Pete. They could have just made this time, just double click this. No one would have even had to have known what it was, right? But they didn't do that. That was very clumsy.
Yeah, I can't get in their head. And again, they were sort of blindsided by the whole thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, and I'll make the point. You don't have to make the point. I'll make the point. I thought what they did was very, very clumsy, and it actually caused more problems than they fixed, because how we found out that they were actually sending this out to various clients was that one of the guys in our group got a message from one of his earlier clients on his machine that he's trying to implement it. It's not working, and he's asking this fella, do you know how this works? And I've gone, how do you even get the patch? And then when we found out that they were basically just sending it out, I wasn't overly happy. That's an understatement, Pete. I'm going, hang on, we're sworn to secrecy. We're not allowed to hand it out to anyone, and these guys are basically messaging it out it was silly. But then I think that got pulled back very, very quickly. And if I've lost count how many people have actually requested that patch, and I've said I can't send it to you. There's no way I'm going to send it to you. And I'm, I'll be saying, well, what version of Cubase are you using? 10. Don't worry about it. Doesn't work on 10.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the changes they made in Cubase 10 were kind of quite, confronting for me in that we were expecting some type of fix for the multimedia class scheduler area. They said that they had fixed it. You no longer needed to patch. You had to remove the registry entry. I'm like, beautiful. And the first thing we noticed in Cubase 10 is that as soon as you turned off ASIO Guard or you leaned on the real-time engine, it would drop all of the number of cores from it would halve at -1, right? So that's what we noticed. And we went, what is that? And then we were looking at the task manager trying to figure out what was going on. So it needed to be 8 physical cores and above, right? So a 6-core, 12-thread would not show the problem. 8 cores and above, all of a sudden you're down to 7 logical cores max. And the task manager was really confusing because the first thread was landing on core, we'll call it core 1, right? So all the physical cores are odd number, and all of the logical cores are even number, right? So core 1 was fully loaded, and then 2, 3, and 4 were ignored, so that's the -1. And then 5 was ignored, and then all of the following threads were on 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, which to me looked like logical cores. So that made no sense, right?
Yeah.
That made no sense. And the only official response that they've posted in, not directly to me, they've never contacted me, but the only official response that I've seen in directly in relation to someone talking about the work reports that I'd posted was that it had nothing to do with multimedia class scheduler, so they didn't even mention it. But all they said was, no, we've made the changes on the Windows 10 engine due to the fact that all previous versions were not efficient with virtual or logical cores. Right. So we are bypassing all hyper-threaded cores and only leaning on the real cores. Well, it doesn't make much sense to me, because I'm going to call BS, because one, why would you leave the virtual and hyper-threaded cores available for 6 cores and below if it was such a problem? That's one. 2, why are they landing on the logical cores, on the hyper-threaded cores? That response I've seen a few times now. Now they even cut and paste it. So if anytime my report comes up, they even cut and paste it. They won't even put their name on it now. Now it just says Steinberg support, and there's this cut and paste thing saying, no, it's because virtual cores, hyperthreading wasn't working correctly on all the engines previous to that, and now that's being fixed in 10 and 10.5. I'm like, okay,
bizarre, yeah.
I mean, I can't. I'm not even going to confront them with it. I'm just going to go, okay, if that's your cut and paste and you're not even putting your name on it, that's fine. Let's see what you come up with Cubase 11.
It reminds me of, like, we'll see lots of threads in different places where one of the tweaks that people do is disable their hyperthreading on their processor. And I've never understood that personally because I haven't seen inefficiencies. I mean, they're not the same as the real core, but I haven't seen any reason to not use them. And maybe Steinberg has, I don't know.
That's being one of my pet peeves with their hyperthreading report, which goes back to the old Pentium 4, right? They kept using that as an excuse.
Way back in the day, yes.
Yeah,
way back.
Yeah, but they've maintained that mantra all the way through. When the i7 first came out, I was arguing with them black and blue and going, can you get rid of this ridiculous technical recommendation to disable hyperthreading to resolve problems, because it just doesn't make any sense. But look, they're still leaning on this whole thing that there's a problem with logical cores. So again, that's their prerogative. Again, I call BS. We'll see what happens with Cubase 11 because that'll be the interesting thing.
It's funny how funny how many different companies I've had to email and say, hey, this optimization guide that you have for Windows is completely outdated.
Oh,
like people shouldn't be doing any of these things anymore, but they're still sitting out there.
Yeah, I just read one this week that I was going to highlight to you. I won't name the company. I'm like, what is this? but I'm not going to name it. Okay, so moving on. Apart from multimedia class scheduler servers, I think the big win, Pete, was the FLS slot number. Yeah. Now, can you pick up the ball and explain that one? Because that was a biggie. And
sure.
The interesting thing was that when it first started making some noise on the forums, one of my close friends in America thought that when I responded to him to ask for some more detail of the plugins that were causing the problem, he actually thought that I was opposing it,
Yeah.
And then he's messaging me, ripping my head off. I'm going, can you calm down for a second? I've just asked I've asked for some detail, right? Pass on the detail. I'll pass it directly to Pete. We'll get this across the line if we can.
Yeah.
Right. And
yep.
Right. So can you explain what that whole area was?
Sure. And really, data is one of those things that we always end up needing. Like, for most issues that come up, I'm always like, can we capture a log or can we get data or something like that? Because then I'm far more likely to get somebody to look at it as an actual problem, as opposed to just saying, hey, I heard something over here isn't working anymore. Can you look into it? They're engineers. That's how they like to work.
Yep.
But so we've been talking about threads in the context of kind of processors, but there's also in any operating system, the concept of a thread, which is just a unit of work that you can do in parallel. And a single processor, a single core might have 50 or 60 threads operating on it at any one point in time, and it just kind of round robins or otherwise schedules them as appropriate. That's one of the services an operating system provides. Then below that, there is something called a fiber, where threads have a certain amount of resource overhead associated with them. So there are these things called fibers, which are lightweight threads, where their scheduling is not quite the same. So they're not preempted, and automatically scheduled, but they, if I remember correctly, they have to cooperatively schedule with each other and whatnot, right? But they're a lightweight thing. Now, each of these things, threads and fibers, have this idea of thread local storage and fiber local storage. And that's just variables and data that you have to set aside that's associated directly with that thread that you can operate on that. Maybe it's a sample or something like that. And the number of fiber local storage thread slots, or fiber local storage, slots out there was 128. And that's a limitation that has lasted forever. It's per process, but it means like once you get over 128 slots used, you can't allocate any more. And because it's such a rare thing to have had happen in the past, most applications don't handle that as an explicit error. They just sort of fold or otherwise just generate a random message.
Right. So how was that directly relating with the plugins? That's the question.
Yep. So then plugins are dynamic link libraries, DLLs, right? Mm-hmm. And the main process of the DAW or a plugin host or whatever is going to load them up. And a lot of developers would directly compile or kind of statically link the C++ runtime with those plugins, so they didn't have to rely on it being installed on your system already. And what that means is like all the code that they used from the C++ runtime got folded up into that same DLL that was being distributed with that as that plugin. And the runtime would use 2 of these FLS slots itself, right? And so each time you loaded up a plugin, you would use up 2 of these FLS slots, or 1 or 2 of these FLS slots, all right? If you have 50 plugins loaded in your DAW, not 50 instances, but 50 unique plugins loaded in a DAW, each of which statically linked to the C++ runtime, you would use up at least like 50 slots.
Right.
Now, a number of those were compiled against the new runtime, which actually used 2 slots instead of 1, which the old one did. Or they would load their own DLLs themselves, which also statically linked the runtime and use slots there. So you would end up with plugins, which Arturia and some other ones.
Yes.
Yeah, Arturia. We'd use like 40, or I forget the exact number.
I thought it was over 50, actually.
It might be over 50, just for that one plugin. And then, of course, the DAW would use a number of slots itself. I talked to all the DAW companies about this and explained what was going on. And while we were working on it, I got, say, like Studio One, they were able to optimize their application so it used far more slots itself to help free those up. The real solution that we had.
So those DAWs were not, I think some of them weren't even using the full available 128 from memory. I think Cubase had to make the available slots up to 128 at one point. Is that the same with Studio One?
So what it was is the DAW was loading DLLs, and it might use 30 or 40 itself.
Right, that's what was happening.
Right.
Okay.
And that's before any plugins.
Right.
And so you end up with like this, like it's a limit where when I tried to explain this to folks, they're like, who on earth is loading 128 DLLs into their application? And I was like, no, that's not it. These are each using more than one. And by the way, musicians commonly load tons of plugins, especially for like template projects or something that you're using.
Yep.
Anyway, so like musicians are doing this. And the real thing we wanted people to do was to dynamically link the C++ runtime as opposed to statically linking it. And what that means is there was one copy of the C++ DLL used in the process that would use only the 2 slots, and then none of the other DLLs would have to use any slots at all, right? But plugin developers, they're optimizing for the install experience. They don't want to have to check to see if the runtime is already installed. And also, a lot of these plugins are old and aren't going to be updated. So, you and I discussed this, and we discussed this with some of the companies and the DAWs and everything. And then I was able to find somebody inside Microsoft who agreed that this was a stupid limitation. It was one of the partner level developers. So it was a pretty high up person who decided in December, when the rest of the company was mostly on vacation, that he was going to fix this because he wasn't going away and he had some peace and quiet to be able to think through it. And so he completely rewrote the whole FLS slot allocation inside the OS, which is kernel code. I can check in code to Windows, but I don't touch the kernel.
Once you start dealing, so kernel, that's ring 0. Is that what they refer to as ring 0? You don't go mucking around at that level unless you're doing something pretty serious.
That would never end well for me if I did anything there. So, so this person did this code and had me look at it, and they went through. They found a couple little compatibility bugs with the way some other applications were working where they had to change that. But eventually that went in as a fix. And now we have an easy way to up the limit. It used to be a very hard-coded limit of 128. Now it's something that they can recompile, but they just need to change it constant. And it's set to, I think it's either 4,000 something or 8,000 something. I forget, but it's a very high number
I thought it was
of slots.
Oh yeah, I thought it was in the 4,000. So it's some ridiculous number. It's basically an arbitrary number that you will never reach.
Right, because he asked me like what I thought was an appropriate number, and then he doubled it. So it's a developer thing, right?
Yeah.
So that made total sense, and that got fixed and went out in one of the releases, and it was a huge deal because it immediately addressed this problem that everybody was starting to run into with the plugins. There was even an FLS checker plug, a VST that people would run.
Yes, I remember that one. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So that wasn't updated. So it still says 128, but you can add, hundreds of plugins and it'll still say there's 128 available because that's all it checked. Right?
Yeah, that's still, the guy hasn't updated the code. And just for everyone's reference, that was introduced in 1903. Right? So Windows 1903, Windows 10 1903, which when it was released then had that DPC latency bug. So we were kind of one step forward, a couple of swear words back, and then it's all kind of resolved now. So
that stuff always makes me very sad. Where I'm like, no, we got this great fix in 1903. Use this, and then there's like some stupid bug.
Yeah. But I mean that was a major score, Pete, and I thought that was great. And there was a bit of a golf, collective golf clap there, and I thought that was awesome.
And really, that is something that no other industry required, right? That's a music industry and pretty much it.
Yeah. And again, that, like I said, that was definitely worthy of a few golf claps. So that was great. And the third one is, now we call it the official way to stop automatic updates, which was basically my group policy editor fix. But now that's official. Which is good.
Official, and I can talk about it. So that was
again,
being able to share it was important.
Well, that's the word of official. That's what I mean by official. So you can point people to that, and that's very, very good. Look, there's still, I call it whack-a-mole. There's still a few little things that they like kind of throwing into the curve. One of them with that whole update thing was, and I don't want to go back too far with it, but one of them was, I think they called it the Windows Update.
Assistant or something?
Windows Update Assistant, and that one there, which would basically reverse settings, and they've got another one now in the service, which I'm not going to speak about, but there's another one in there that sticks its head up and goes, hang on, I think that could be a problem with the update procedure, and then it starts reversing stuff, or there's a potential to start reversing stuff.
Because it thinks it's a broken system. Yeah.
Yes, correct. And then we found another group policy setting that has now been neutered, which we kind of discovered when one of my clients got a very odd spiked core problem. I don't want to discuss that one just yet because hopefully we can find some way to fix that one. But
it's an ongoing process.
Yeah,
for sure.
Whack-a-mole, But it's not. Look, I wanted to kind of make those points that as much as I'll still grumble about Windows 10 and some of the policy stuff, but it's not all negative, and then it's a fantastic operating system. I do, a fair level of optimizations. Some people stick their head up onto various threads and go, "Oh, mate, you don't need anything. Vanilla install and a power change." I'm going, okay, good luck.
That's all I need for myself, but but I'm not supporting hundreds of customers.
Yeah, well, all I can say with those guys, good luck with that, because I've had various clients that have approached me that have done Windows upgrades and updates and hosed the thing, and I've got to go in there, remote in and fix the stuff. So I'm not going to detail it because, what's the point? People are going to go, well, that's not my experience. And I think, that's BS. I'm like, well, I can only sweep my own steps, Pete, So it is an ongoing thing. And look, I'll keep dabbling with it. I've played with, some of the Windows 10 versions like LTSC, for example. That was my perfect kind of workstation platform, but the code doesn't go past. I think the one I was playing with was 1607. The LTSC doesn't go past 1809. Right, yeah. Guess what? There's no FLS fix. No point. So we just I'll just continue dealing with whatever the release versions are, and I'll do my optimizations and keep my head down and keep whacking the mole, so to speak.
Yeah. And it's been good with the, kind of the little DAW group that you've set up, that when we find things, we can share them with each other, and it makes it a lot easier for me to kind of get that information back up in a timely manner, because we do find stuff, right? There's always something.
Yeah.
And so that's been a huge help.
Yeah, and away from the noise of the peanut gallery, so to speak. And again, I'll just keep them guessing. I'll just keep them guessing, thinking that, I'm somehow, this guy that is the enemy of Windows 10, and I always chuckle when there's a couple of guys that will always come in your defense if I say something and they feel that I've been impolite.
I appreciate the defense, but sometimes,
Yes. If only they knew, Pete. If only they knew.
Yes.
Hey,
you're a horrible person. I need protection from you.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. No worries. Hey, listen, one last thing, because I do want to cover this, because this is your specific area. Now, that's audio MIDI in Windows 10. There is some areas there that you're working on. A new MIDI stack, core isolation, Wasapi low latency. Is there anything there that you want to share or you can share with us?
So the core isolation, because people ask me about this all the time, I'll just mention quickly, is something that we did primarily for Windows Phone.
Yep.
But then Windows Phone went away, so that didn't make a whole lot of sense. And then the number of cores that we're getting in processors now is just starting to go way, way up, so it makes less sense as well. But the idea was that all the audio processing would go on like a single core, which on a phone makes sense, but or a small subset of cores. But on these new devices, not so much, right? So that's something that we experimented with for a little bit. And there are some things actually that made it into game mode, where we moved some things to other cores.
Right.
And I had some of the DAW companies try it out, and they actually said that was a net negative performance wise for their particular DAW. So we're not pursuing that one so much these days, but I still keep it in the back of my head in case it is something that's useful in the future. Then the MIDI side, yes. I introduced this at the last NAMM, which was the last live in-person NAMM, where I'm working on an update to our MIDI stack with some other folks that is going to solve a lot of the MIDI issues that we have. Being able to rename things, being able to have multi-client devices, virtual MIDI, including Bluetooth in the stack in a way that people will use it, etc. So it's an ongoing project, and actually the COVID stuff has made it drag out longer than I had originally planned, but because it's also harder to collaborate with different folks on this. And internally, because of it, we've reprioritized a bunch of other things, so it's taken away some of the other folks that I was working with. But it's something I'm still working on, and hopefully we'll have a release that people can start looking at early next year.
Yeah. So is that going to coincide with MIDI 2, or is that also relevant to MIDI 1?
So it'll go out. It's MIDI. So first of all, MIDI 1 support. All of these changes are being made with MIDI 1 in mind.
Yep.
MIDI 2 is something that we absolutely want to support on there, but it does require us to have a new class driver. And that's part of the thing we're trying to involve folks from other teams. That one's going to end up taking a bit longer than planned. But for sure, people will see the real benefits here with MIDI 1. The DAW developers, to use the features, will need to update their code, though. So it's not something that will necessarily work with everything that's out there today.
Right. Okay. But I mean, that's actually really good. I mean, if we can get something back to what I would call Atari level MIDI tightness.
Yeah.
Man, I mean, that's something that I noticed from moving from that Atari that had the actual MIDI port, and the MIDI stack was right in that kernel level.
It's a serial line directly off the processor in that case.
That was brilliant. So that was one of the hardest things for me, being a keyboard player and doing a whole stack of MIDI sequencing and stuff at the time. When I went to Windows, I went, what the hell?
What's funny about this is I did measure this, and we've had this talk, and I've also talked to some of the synth companies that we're talking about jitter and things in the past, where our MIDI stack jitter over USB with, I was using an iConnectivity MIO interface, which is, a good interface. It's not a cheap knockoff like one of the ones that you get for $5 on Amazon. I was getting, I think, total round trip latency when I just connected the output to the input. So I didn't have a synthesizer involved or anything, was like under 2 milliseconds. It was like 1 point something along there.
Yeah, and that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's a serial protocol. It's going to be like longer than, it's going to be almost all that time to send a message anyway.
Yep.
But there's a lot of talk out there about how bad our MIDI jitter is, but I'm just not seeing it in any tests I've done yet. So I suspect it's highly hardware dependent.
Yeah, and that's got to come down to the people that are actually making those posts and those to actually bring something to the table so you can actually work with. Now, I will make the point that when I just said what's going on here, that was Windows 95. I mean,
absolutely.
As we moved on further and further, I can't remember any problem by XP. Nothing in Windows 7, or Windows 10. Nothing that's actually reported to me by any of the clients.
I think it just gets repeat. It's one of those things that people read online and repeat, and it's, there's a lot of. We could have a whole call about this, so I won't go into much detail here. But there's a lot of sort of the cognitive bias that folks have when they think something is going to be a certain way, and it comes up all the time with like bit rates and stuff for for recording.
Yeah.
If you're doing like 96 or 192 or whatever folks are doing there, where similar things I think happen with like MIDI jitter and stuff as well.
Yeah. And look, and then those conversations are almost like Groundhog Day. They'll always pop up once every couple of years. Whether it's
guaranteed.
A to D, D to A. The zero sum thing in the doors, and I just every time
the through hole versus SMD components, like there's a whole bunch of mythology out there with different things.
And it's the internets. What can we say?
Of course.
Yeah. Hey, Pete, I think, man, we've been going. We're over the 2 hour mark, and we are, and both of us can talk the legs off a chair. So I reckon if you let us loose, we'll probably keep going. But I think let's put a pin in it now, because there's definitely more to discuss, right?
Yeah.
So let's put a pin in it now. I'm going to get you back and we'll cover some of the other stuff that we didn't get to today. But I think for today, thank you very, very much for your time and energy. That's been awesome. I think we covered a whole stack of ground. And
thanks to anybody who's hung in here for the full 2 hours or whatever this is.
They'll probably, they probably went and made a sandwich halfway and came back or something.
Yeah.
But so look, thank you very, very much. And let's continue this on the next one. And thank you very much for everyone that has actually listened in, and on to the next.
Great chatting with you. Thanks.
Cheers.